What would you do if a flight attendant publicly shamed you, a pregnant woman, in front of an entire plane? Imagine the sting of humiliation, the weight of every judgmental eye on you, as you're dismissed like you're nothing more than a nuisance. This is the story of Maya Carter, a 7-month pregnant woman who boarded a flight expecting a safe, uneventful journey, only to face cruelty that grounded the plane and sparked a movement for justice. Her quiet strength turned a moment of disrespect into a powerful lesson in dignity, accountability, and the courage to stand firm. Picture yourself in Maya's shoes. The plane's about to take off, and you've just been insulted. Would you confront the attendant directly, or stay calm and call for help? Share your choice in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We're the Daily Narrated Stories channel, and we need your support to hit 1,000 subscribers soon. Please subscribe and join our community for more powerful stories that inspire and uplift, just like this one. Maya Carter stepped onto the plane with a cautious gait, her hand cradling her swollen belly under a soft lavender sweater, the fabric slightly worn at the edges from months of wear. At 7 months pregnant, every movement felt heavy, deliberate, as if the weight of her unborn child pressed not just on her body, but on her spirit. She'd flown before, but this was her first solo trip without her husband, Daniel, and a flicker of unease settled in her chest. Not from the flight itself, but from the vulnerability of traveling alone in her condition. The terminal air had been thick with the mingled scents of burnt coffee, jet fuel, and the faint floral perfume of a nearby passenger, a sensory overload that made her head swim. She'd chosen a seat in business class, not for luxury, but for proximity to assistance if needed, a precaution she'd paid extra for when booking, her fingers trembling slightly as she'd clicked the confirmation button weeks ago. Settling into her seat, Maya exhaled slowly, the ache in her lower back easing as she arranged a water bottle and a small bag of almonds on the tray table. The crinkle of the plastic packet a small, grounding sound in the chaos of boarding. The tray's cool metal felt like a lifeline against her fingertips, a tangible anchor amidst her growing nerves. She glanced out the window, watching ground crew in neon vests move with practiced efficiency, their shouts muffled by the thick glass, their movements a blur of orange against the gray tarmac. Her mind drifted to Daniel's last words before she left. "Call me if anything feels off." She hadn't expected to need that advice so soon, but the memory of his voice, steady, reassuring, wrapped around her like a warm blanket, even as her heart raced with a quiet fear she couldn't name. The cabin buzzed with passengers boarding, a symphony of rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the occasional laugh that felt too loud in the confined space. Some offered her warm smiles. A mother with a toddler nodded sympathetically, her eyes soft with understanding, while others barely glanced her way, their faces buried in phones or magazines. A businessman in a pinstripe suit brushed past, his briefcase knocking against her armrest with a sharp thud, his muttered apology barely audible as he hurried to his seat. Maya's breath caught, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, a protective gesture that had become second nature. The cabin smelled of recycled air and the faint tang of cleaning solution, a sterile scent that did little to ease her nerves. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, but the unease lingered, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Then, the head flight attendant, Sylvia Monroe, strode past, tall, impeccably dressed in a navy uniform that seemed to gleam under the cabin lights, her steps sharp and purposeful, like a metronome marking time. Sylvia's eyes lingered on Maya's belly, narrowing with a faint judgment that sent a shiver down Maya's spine. The attendant's gaze was cold, calculating, as if Maya's pregnancy were an inconvenience she hadn't signed up for. "Excuse me," Sylvia said, her tone clipped, arms crossed tightly against her chest, her name tag glinting with a harsh metallic sheen. "Did someone already help you with your bag?" Maya blinked, her voice soft but firm, though her throat felt dry, the words sticking like sandpaper. "No, not yet. The gate agent said the crew would assist me." Sylvia's lips pursed, her gaze hardening, a storm brewing behind her hazel eyes. "That's not our job. You should have arranged for a medical assistant if you can't handle your own things." The words hit Maya like a cold wave, each syllable a shard of ice that pierced her chest, stealing her breath. She felt her cheeks flush, a burning heat that spread from her face to her ears, her heart sinking as Sylvia's dismissal echoed in the quiet cabin. The hum of the plane's systems seemed to grow louder, amplifying the silence that followed, a silence that felt like a spotlight on her vulnerability. "I requested help when I booked. It's part of your special care policy," Maya explained, her voice steady despite the sting, her fingers clutching the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. She fought to keep her composure, but inside, a storm raged, fear, shame, and a quiet anger she didn't dare let surface. Sylvia scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain, each word a lash against Maya's already fragile resolve. "That policy is for real medical conditions, not for people who don't want to lift their own bags." The air grew heavy, and Maya's chest tightened, not from anger, but from the fear of being seen as a burden, a fear that had haunted her since childhood. Her mind flashed to a memory, a moment from years ago that felt like a ghost haunting her now. She was 15, standing in a classroom, her hand raised to ask a question about a math problem she couldn't solve. The teacher, a stern woman with gray hair and a pinched expression, had rolled her eyes, muttering, "If you can't keep up, maybe you don't belong here." The class had laughed, their giggles a chorus of humiliation that burned hotter than the summer sun outside. Maya had sat down, her cheeks flaming, her question unanswered, the shame a weight she carried for years. Now, on this plane, the same quiet disrespect gnawed at her, the kind that didn't make headlines but left scars all the same, scars that throbbed with every dismissive word Sylvia spoke. Sylvia sighed dramatically, muttering, "Unbelievable," as she yanked Maya's bag into the overhead bin with a careless shove, the door slamming shut with a loud thud that made Maya flinch, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a gunshot. The bag, a small, faded gray carry-on, tumbled slightly inside the bin, its contents shifting with a muffled thud, a sound that felt like an echo of Maya's own heart. Sylvia walked away without a glance, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a staccato rhythm that seemed to mock Maya's stillness. Maya sat frozen in her seat, her hands trembling slightly, the lavender sweater suddenly feeling too tight, the fabric clinging to her skin as her breath came in shallow bursts. Her throat burned with unshed tears, but she swallowed them down, refusing to let them fall. Not here, not now, not in front of strangers who already saw her as less than. Around her, a few passengers had witnessed the exchange, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away, as if her humiliation were contagious. A woman across the aisle, her hair pulled into a neat bun, glanced over, her eyes flickering with unease, but she quickly buried her face in her novel, her fingers tightening around the pages. The man beside Maya, an older gentleman in a tailored suit named Edward, shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes scuffing against the carpet as he adjusted his position, his gaze fixed on the safety pamphlet in his lap. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words died on his lips, his silence a heavier weight than any words could have been. Maya pulled out her phone, her fingers unsteady as she typed a message to Daniel. Crew refused help. Attendant was rude, tossed my bag like it was trash. I'm okay, just shaken. She hit send, her breath shallow, the screen blurring slightly as her eyes stung with the tears she refused to shed. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo the baby's kicks, each movement a reminder of the life she was carrying, a life she wanted to shield from the cruelty of the world. Seconds later, her phone lit up with a reply. I'm calling the airline now. Stay calm. Don't say anything else. Maya locked her phone, her hand resting on her belly as her baby kicked again, a small, grounding reminder amidst the storm brewing inside her. She whispered to herself, "We're okay, little one," her voice barely audible, a mantra to keep her anchored, a promise to her child that she would not break, no matter how hard the world tried to push her down. As the plane's engines hummed softly, a low, steady vibration that seemed to pulse through the floor, the cabin filled with the routine of pre-flight preparations. Sylvia avoided Maya's row, her smile reserved for other passengers, a stark contrast to the coldness she'd shown moments ago. She offered a warm greeting to a man in a suit 2 rows ahead, her voice bright and professional, the kind of warmth Maya longed for but knew she wouldn't receive. Maya sat quietly, her hands folded over her stomach, trying to steady her breathing, the rhythm of her inhales and exhales a quiet rebellion against the chaos in her mind. But beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts raced, replaying Sylvia's sharp tone, the dismissive glance, the way the bin had slammed shut as if Maya herself were insignificant. The memory of Sylvia's words played on a loop in her mind, each repetition a fresh wound. That's not our job. She thought of all the times she'd been made to feel small, invisible. Times when she'd asked for help and been met with disdain. Times when she'd been judged before she even opened her mouth. She remembered a moment from her first pregnancy, standing in a grocery store line, her belly just beginning to show, when a cashier had snapped at her for asking for help with her bags. "If you can't carry them, don't shop," the cashier had said, her tone sharp, her eyes cold. Maya had left in tears, the shame burning hotter than the summer sun outside. The weight of her groceries nothing compared to the weight of being dismissed. Now, on this plane, the memory felt like a ghost, haunting her with the same sting of rejection, a reminder of how normal it had become for people to look at her and see nothing worth helping. Edward glanced her way, his lips parting as if to speak, but he hesitated, his fingers tightening around the pages of his magazine, the paper crinkling under his grip. Maya noticed the subtle avoidance, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, a man caught between guilt and inaction, his silence a heavier burden than any words could have been. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration a jolt against her thigh, and she checked it discreetly. "I spoke to their emergency ops team. They're contacting the crew now. Stay put." Daniel's words were calm but firm, a tone Maya knew meant action was coming. She pictured him in their living room, pacing as he spoke on the phone, his voice steady but laced with the quiet fury he reserved for moments of injustice. The image brought her a flicker of comfort, a reminder that she wasn't alone, even if it felt that way in this moment. At the front of the plane, Sylvia laughed lightly with a younger attendant, Lily Harper, who had watched the earlier interaction with quiet unease, her soft brown eyes flickering with concern. The galley smelled of brewing coffee, the aroma mingling with the faint tang of cleaning supplies, a sterile scent that did little to ease the tension in the air. Lily's hands paused as she arranged water bottles on a tray, her movements deliberate, her expression troubled. "You were a bit harsh with that woman, weren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle, her tone laced with a quiet reproach. Sylvia rolled her eyes, sipping her coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp with defensiveness. "I'm not a babysitter. She should have booked wheelchair service if she needed help." Lily didn't respond, turning to organize her tray, but her silence spoke volumes, a quiet dissent that Sylvia either didn't notice or chose to ignore, her confidence unshaken by the younger attendant's words. Maya shifted in her seat, the ache in her lower back intensifying as the tension in her body grew, a dull throb that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She leaned forward slightly, adjusting her posture, the fabric of her sweater brushing against her skin with a soft rustle, the sound of faint comfort in the storm of her thoughts. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and recycled air, a reminder of the confined space she couldn't escape, a space that felt smaller with every passing moment. Her mind raced with what-ifs. What if she'd spoken up louder? What if she'd demanded an apology on the spot? What if she'd never boarded this flight at all? But she pushed the thoughts down, her hand resting on her belly, the baby's movements a quiet reassurance, a reminder of why she couldn't let this break her. She wondered if her child could sense her fear, if the rapid beat of her heart was a drumbeat echoing through her womb. a rhythm of resilience in the face of adversity. Edward cleared his throat beside her, his voice low, his eyes fixed on his magazine as if it could shield him from the tension. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice trembling slightly, a mix of guilt and unease. "That was harsh." Maya met his gaze, her eyes searching his for a flicker of genuine support, but all she saw was discomfort, a man who'd rather look away than act. "Yes, it was," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a quiet pain, a pain that had been building for years, a pain she'd learned to carry in silence. He nodded once, then looked away. No apology, no support, just a fleeting acknowledgement that left Maya feeling more isolated than before, a reminder of how often people chose silence over action. A few rows back, a young couple whispered to each other, their glances darting toward Maya, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She couldn't hear their words, but the weight of their stares felt like a spotlight, not of empathy, but of unease, as if her presence alone had disrupted their flight. The woman's eyes lingered on Maya's belly, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease, while the man whispered something that made her nod slowly, their voices a low hum that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. Maya's fingers hovered over her phone, rereading Daniel's message. "Just stay put." She intended to do just that, but knot in her stomach told her something bigger was unfolding, a shift she couldn't yet see but could feel in the air, heavy and charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sylvia's confidence remained unshaken as she moved through the cabin, her demeanor polished but selective, her smile a mask that hid the storm brewing beneath. She paused to ask Edward if he needed a drink, her voice bright and professional, pointedly ignoring Maya as if she were invisible, a slight that felt deliberate, a silent reinforcement of Sylvia's earlier dismissal. The slight cut deeper than Maya expected, a fresh wound on top of the one Sylvia had already inflicted. Lily, trailing behind with a tray of water bottles, hesitated near Maya's seat, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were weighing her words. Their eyes met briefly, and Lily offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of kindness in the storm, a gesture that made Maya's chest ache with a mix of gratitude and longing for more. Then Lily moved on, her footsteps soft against the carpeted aisle, her tray rattling slightly as she walked away. Maya's mind drifted to another memory, a moment from her past that felt like a mirror to this one. She'd been at a corporate event, early in her career, her heels pinching her feet as she stood in a room full of colleagues who barely acknowledged her. She'd offered an idea during a discussion, her voice steady but her palms sweaty, only for a senior colleague to dismiss her with a laugh, assuming her youth and race made her irrelevant. "Stick to taking notes, sweetheart," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescension, the room erupting in laughter as Maya's cheeks burned with shame. She'd stayed quiet then, too, but the sting had lingered for months, a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of how often she'd been judged before she even opened her mouth. Now, on this plane, the same quiet disrespect gnawed at her, a familiar pain that made her wonder if things would ever change. Up front, the cockpit phone buzzed, its shrill tone cutting through the hum of the cabin, a sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air. Captain James Thornton, a seasoned pilot with a calm demeanor, answered, his expression shifting as he listened, his brow furrowing slightly, his hand tightening around the receiver. "Yes, sir." "Understood," he said, his voice measured, his jaw set with a quiet resolve. "We'll hold for further instruction." He hung up and pressed a button to summon Sylvia, the red light on the panel blinking ominously, a silent warning of what was to come. She stepped into the cockpit, her posture stiffening, her fingers brushing nervously against her uniform, her confidence beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of unease, a tremor that she tried to hide. James looked at her, his gaze steady, his jaw set, his voice calm but firm. "We've received a directive from corporate. There's a concern about a passenger interaction in your cabin. They need clarification before we depart." Sylvia's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing defensively, her hands clenching at her sides. If this is about the pregnant woman, I followed safety protocol. She didn't arrange proper assistance. Her voice was sharp, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in her polished facade, a sign that she was beginning to feel the weight of her actions. James didn't argue, but his tone was firm, unyielding, a quiet warning that sent a chill down Sylvia's spine. They're saying it involves your behavior toward a passenger with medical clearance. The ground manager's on the line now. You'll need to explain yourself carefully. Sylvia's breath hitched, her mind racing as she tried to piece together how a simple interaction had escalated so quickly, how a moment of disdain had turned into a corporate directive. Back in the cabin, the lights flickered as the delay stretched on, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the stalled journey. Maya noticed the shift in atmosphere. Passengers whispering, a businessman in the front row glancing toward the galley with confusion, his brow furrowed as he checked his watch, his impatience a palpable thing. Her water bottle sat unopened, condensation beating on the plastic, a small puddle forming on the tray table, a quiet reminder of the time that seemed to stretch endlessly. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration a jolt against her thigh, a lifeline in the storm of her thoughts. They're freezing the takeoff. This is being addressed now. Maya closed her eyes, the words sinking in, not with relief, but with a quiet certainty that this wouldn't be ignored. She pictured Daniel's face, his jaw set, his eyes burning with determination as he spoke to the airline's emergency team, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. The image brought her a flicker of hope, a reminder that justice might be possible, even in a world that so often turned a blind eye. Sylvia emerged from the cockpit, her face tighter, her fingers twitching at her sides as she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking with a hollow sound against the floor. The cheerful boarding announcements had stopped, and the delay felt heavy, charged, the air thick with unspoken questions, a tension that seemed to press against the walls of the plane. In the galley, Sylvia leaned toward Lily, her voice low but strained, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air, a bitter reminder of the normalcy that had been shattered. They're questioning my conduct over a simple request. Apparently, someone didn't like how I handled the pregnant woman. Her words were sharp, but her hands betrayed her, fingers tapping nervously against the counter, a rhythm of anxiety that she couldn't hide. Lily's response was calm, measured, her eyes steady as she arranged napkins, her movements deliberate, almost methodical. Did they ask for your side? Sylvia nodded, her eyes narrowing, a defensive edge to her voice, a shield against the truth she didn't want to face. Yes, and I told them the truth. She wanted special treatment, and I didn't have time to coddle her. Lily didn't reply, her silence a subtle rebuke as she turned away, her movements slow, deliberate, a quiet protest against Sylvia's actions. Sylvia pressed, her voice rising slightly, a note of desperation creeping in. What? You think I was wrong? Lily's voice was soft but firm, her gaze unflinching, her words a mirror Sylvia couldn't escape. It's not about what I think. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken truth, a reminder that Sylvia's actions were no longer just her own to justify. The cabin's tension grew palpable, a living thing that seemed to press against the walls of the plane, the air thick with the scent of uncertainty, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the stalled journey. A man a few rows up stood to open the overhead bin, his impatience clear as he muttered under his breath, his movements jerky, his frustration a palpable thing. A woman pressed her call button, then canceled it, as if unsure, her fingers hovering over the panel, her breath shallow as she glanced around the cabin. Maya sat still, her hand on her belly, the baby's gentle kicks a quiet comfort amidst the unease, a reminder of why she couldn't let this break her. She wondered if her child could sense her fear, if the rapid beat of her heart was a drumbeat echoing through her womb, a rhythm of resilience in the face of adversity, a promise that she would fight for a better world, even if it meant fighting in silence. The intercom crackled, and James's voice filled the cabin, steady but formal, cutting through the murmurs, a voice of authority that seemed to anchor the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to pause departure due to an internal matter. We appreciate your patience as we resolve it. Sylvia flinched at the announcement, her eyes darting toward Maya's row, a flicker of panic crossing her face, her hands clenching at her sides as the reality of her actions began to sink in. The cabin buzzed with whispers, passengers exchanging glances, some landing on Maya with curiosity, others on Sylvia with suspicion, their voices a low hum of speculation that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. The silence grew heavier as minutes ticked by, the weight of anticipation pressing down on the cabin, a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Passengers stopped chatting, their magazines untouched, their eyes shifting nervously, the air thick with the scent of uncertainty, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the stalled journey. Maya remained calm on the outside, but inside, her heartbeat thrummed with purpose, a steady rhythm that echoed her resolve, a resolve that had been forged through years of quiet battles she'd fought in silence, but never forgotten. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene, yet the entire flight had shifted around her, a testament to the power of her quiet resolve, a power she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. In the cockpit, the phone buzzed again, its shrill tone a stark contrast to the hum of the cabin, a sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air. James answered, his expression tightening as a voice far higher up the chain spoke, its tone clipped and authoritative, a voice that carried the weight of power. "I understand," he said after a moment, his hand gripping the armrest of his seat, his knuckles white with the effort. "Yes, I'll inform her now." He turned to summon Sylvia again, the red light on the panel blinking like a warning, a silent harbinger of what was to come. She stepped in, her nerves now visible beneath her polished exterior, her fingers brushing against her uniform as if to steady herself, her breath shallow as she braced for what was next. "They've escalated it," James said plainly, his voice devoid of emotion, a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath. "You're to speak with the senior director of flight operations now." Sylvia blinked, her voice tight, a tremor of fear beneath her words, a crack in her facade that she couldn't hide. "A director?" James's gaze was unwavering, his jaw set, his voice calm but firm. "This flight is halted on her behalf." Sylvia's breath hitched, her mind racing as she tried to piece together how this had spiraled so far, how a moment of disdain had turned into a corporate directive. Sylvia muttered, "Of course," her tone bitter, her mind racing as she tried to piece together how this had spiraled so far, how a moment of disdain had turned into a corporate directive. James's voice was firm, a warning laced with gravity, a reminder of the stakes at play. "This isn't a joke, Sylvia. They're watching your response closely." She turned sharply and walked back into the cabin, her face pale, but her posture rigid, a mask of control that was beginning to crack, her heels clicking with a hollow sound against the floor. She paused near the galley, her eyes locking on Maya's for the first time in nearly half an hour. Maya met her gaze, her expression unreadable, a quiet strength radiating from her stillness, a strength that seemed to fill the space between them, a strength that Sylvia couldn't ignore. Sylvia approached, crouching slightly beside Maya's row, her voice low and overly controlled, the words forced through a tight smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I'd like to clear up a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to come across as disrespectful earlier. We've been under a lot of pressure, and..." Maya raised a hand, stopping her, her movement slow and deliberate, a quiet command that silenced Sylvia mid-sentence. She studied Sylvia's face, the nervous twitch of her lips, the stiffness in her eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the cracks in her polished facade. "I didn't ask for anything unreasonable," Maya said softly, her voice steady, each word a weight that pressed against Sylvia's defenses, a weight that Sylvia couldn't escape. "You decided I didn't deserve basic kindness." Sylvia swallowed hard, her throat tight, her hands clenching at her sides, her breath shallow as she tried to hold onto her composure. "I didn't mean..." Maya cut her off, her tone calm but piercing, a blade wrapped in velvet, a quiet condemnation that hit harder than any shout. You meant exactly what you said. You made a choice, and now someone else is making one too. Nearby, passengers listened in silence, their breaths held, the air thick with tension, a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. A woman peered over her sunglasses, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and curiosity, her fingers tightening around the armrest. A man subtly pulled out his phone, recording the exchange while pretending to check messages, his fingers trembling slightly as he captured the moment, a moment that would change everything. Sylvia stood slowly, her lips tight, her composure fraying at the edges as she walked back to the galley, her heels clicking with a hollow sound against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of her apology. Inside the galley, Lily wiped a tray, her movements deliberate, the cloth moving in slow, methodical circles, a quiet protest against Sylvia's actions. They asked for a statement, didn't they? She asked quietly, her voice soft but pointed, her eyes steady as she met Sylvia's gaze. Sylvia didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the counter, her breath coming in short bursts, her hands trembling as she tried to hold onto her composure. Did you tell the truth? Lily pressed, her gaze unflinching, her words a mirror Sylvia couldn't escape. Sylvia's voice was sharp, a defensive edge cutting through her words, a shield against the truth she didn't want to face. I told them what they needed to hear. Lily's gaze was steady, her voice calm but firm, her words a quiet condemnation. You told them what you thought would save you. The words hung between them, heavy with truth, a truth that Sylvia couldn't outrun. Sylvia's breath hitched, the weight of her actions sinking in, a slow realization that this wasn't just about a moment anymore. It was about the consequences that followed, consequences she couldn't escape. The cabin grew restless, the tension a living thing that seemed to press against the walls of the plane, the air thick with the scent of uncertainty. The hum of the engines a constant reminder of the stalled journey. Passengers pressed call buttons, sighed loudly, or stood to stretch, their frustration mounting, their voices a low hum of discontent that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. But no one approached Maya, though they all knew what had happened. They'd seen Sylvia's tone, her dismissal, her refusal to help a woman who'd asked for something so small, a request that should have been met with kindness, not disdain. Maya reached into her bag for a packet of crackers, her stomach churning with nerves, not hunger, the taste of salt a faint comfort against the bitterness in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the packet, the crinkle of the plastic a small, grounding sound in the chaos of her thoughts. Her phone buzzed. They've grounded the flight for you. The words settled in her chest, heavy but affirming, a quiet victory she hadn't sought but couldn't deny, a victory that felt both empowering and exhausting. She closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the day pressing down on her, a weight that seemed to carry the echoes of every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd been made to feel less than. In the galley, Sylvia stood with her arms crossed, her confidence replaced by defensiveness, her posture rigid as if bracing for a blow, her hands clenching at her sides. Lily watched silently, her expression unreadable, her hands still as she stood a few feet away, her presence a quiet rebuke. The phone buzzed again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence, a sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air, and Sylvia answered with a shaky hand, her fingers trembling as she lifted the receiver. Sylvia is speaking, she said, her voice trembling, a crack in her polished facade, a crack that revealed the fear beneath. The voice on the other end was firm, laced with disappointment that hit harder than anger, a disappointment that seemed to echo the weight of Sylvia's actions. This is Director Andrew Blake. Did you refuse to assist a medically cleared pregnant passenger and dismiss her with inappropriate remarks? Sylvia hesitated, her mouth dry, her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo the chaos of her thoughts. There was a miscommunication. She didn't request special handling properly, Sylvia said, her voice wavering, her breath shallow as she tried to hold onto her composure. That's not what I asked, Andrew replied, his tone unyielding, each word a weight that pressed against Sylvia's defenses, a weight that she couldn't escape. Sylvia's voice trembled, her breath shallow, her hands clenching at her sides as she tried to hold onto her composure. I refused to help her, yes. I told her it wasn't our job, but I didn't mean to insult her. The silence on the other end stretched long, a void that seemed to swallow her words, a silence that felt like a judgment she couldn't outrun. Her husband is on the board, Andrew said finally, his voice low, heavy with implication. Did you know that? Sylvia's throat tightened, her knees trembling as the realization hit her. No, I didn't. Well, now you do. He's demanding accountability. The plane is grounded, and you'll be removed before it continues. Security will escort you off. You're suspended, effective immediately. Sylvia's breath caught, her knees trembling as she set the phone down, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the receiver. She turned to Lily, who stood still, her face a mask of quiet observation, her eyes reflecting the weight of what she'd heard. You heard that, didn't you? Sylvia whispered, her voice barely audible, a plea for reassurance she knew wouldn't come. Lily nodded, her voice soft but firm, her words a quiet condemnation. Every word. Sylvia sank into the jump seat, her legs giving out, her body collapsing under the weight of her actions. For the first time in her career, she was being removed from a flight, not for illness or emergency, but for failing to treat someone with basic humanity, a failure that now defined her in the eyes of everyone on board. Back in the cabin, Maya sipped her water, her movements deliberate, her eyes clear, a quiet strength radiating from her stillness, a strength that seemed to fill the space around her. Passengers buzzed with energy as whispers of the grounded flight spread, their voices a low hum of speculation and unease, a hum that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. James emerged from the cockpit, his presence commanding attention as he walked down the aisle, his uniform crisp, his posture steady, a quiet authority in his movements. He stopped a few rows from Maya, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the murmurs, a voice of authority that seemed to anchor the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've encountered an issue involving a crew member's conduct. To ensure the safety and dignity of all passengers, we're resolving it before takeoff. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, a wave of sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air, a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting away, while others leaned forward with interest, their curiosity piqued, their voices a low hum of speculation. James continued, his tone measured, a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath. A flight attendant will be deboarding, and a replacement will join us shortly. We apologize for the inconvenience. He nodded and returned to the cockpit, his footsteps steady, a quiet authority in his movements. The announcement was brief but clear, and everyone knew who it was about, their glances shifting between Maya and the galley, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. Sylvia stood by the galley, her hands clenched, feeling the weight of every glance, the air thick with the scent of judgment, a scent that seemed to cling to her like smoke. The aircraft door opened with a firm click, the sound echoing through the cabin, a sound that seemed to echo the finality of Sylvia's actions, and a ramp agent stepped on, followed by a security officer in a navy jacket, his badge glinting under the cabin lights, a silent harbinger of what was to come. The cabin fell silent, the tension a palpable thing that seemed to press against the walls of the plane, a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Sylvia stepped forward, her face pale, her posture fragile, a cracked shell of the confidence she'd once exuded. I'll be stepping off the flight, she said quietly, her voice forced, a tremor beneath her words, a tremor that revealed the fear beneath. Thank you all. No one responded. Not a single passenger. Not even Lily, who stood with her hands folded at her waist, her expression unreadable, her silence a heavier weight than any words could have been. As Sylvia walked down the aisle, Maya met her gaze, her expression calm, unshaken, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space between them, a strength that Sylvia couldn't ignore. Sylvia paused for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and regret. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely audible. A plea for forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve, a plea that fell flat in the face of Maya's quiet strength. "I shouldn't have treated you that way." Maya's voice was light but firm, her words a quiet condemnation that hit harder than any shout. "I know." The words carried a crushing weight, a weight that Sylvia couldn't escape, a weight that seemed to echo the finality of her actions. Sylvia nodded once, then walked off the plane, escorted by the officer, her heels clicking with a hollow sound against the jet bridge, a sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of her apology. The tension lifted slowly as the doors shut behind them. The sound of final punctuation to Sylvia's exit, a sound that seemed to echo the shift in the air. A woman across the aisle leaned toward Maya, her voice hushed, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and guilt, her fingers twisting the hem of her scarf as she spoke. "Did that really just happen?" Maya nodded, her expression neutral, her hands steady in her lap, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around her. The woman looked down, guilt flickering in her eyes, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I should have said something earlier." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence had already spoken volumes, a quiet power that had shifted the entire flight, a power that had changed everything. Lily stepped forward, her voice softer but more confident than before, a newfound strength in her posture, a strength that seemed to echo Maya's own. "We'll be departing shortly. A new lead attendant is on the way. If anyone needs anything, I'm here." She looked at Maya, her gaze sincere, her eyes reflecting a quiet apology, an apology that felt genuine, not forced. "I apologize for what happened. It wasn't right." Maya offered a small nod, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke of her strength, her refusal to be diminished, a refusal that had changed everything. The mood in the cabin shifted permanently, the quiet becoming something new, respect, recognition, accountability, a shift that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Maya checked her phone. "She's off the flight." "You did well," without raising your voice. She locked the screen, a faint sense of peace settling in, a warmth that spread through her chest like the first rays of dawn, a warmth that felt like hope, a hope she hadn't dared to feel until now. She hadn't done anything but ask for what she was promised and refused to shrink when someone decided she didn't matter, a quiet act of defiance that had changed everything, a defiance that had grounded a plane and shifted the world. The new lead attendant, Evelyn Grant, arrived minutes later, an older woman with a quiet confidence, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but kind, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. She moved through the cabin with steady eyes, offering nods and brief greetings, signaling a new tone for the flight, a tone of respect and professionalism that had been absent before. Passengers settled, but the tension lingered, a quiet undercurrent that seemed to hum beneath the surface, a reminder of what had happened, a reminder of the power of quiet strength. Some whispered to seatmates, their voices low, their words a mix of awe and guilt, while others avoided eye contact, grappling with their silence during the incident. Maya remained still, her hands on her stomach, her presence now a quiet force, a beacon of strength in the midst of the storm. Edward, the man beside her, sat up straighter, his earlier half-hearted comment weighing on him, a heavy burden he couldn't shake, a burden that seemed to press against his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice trembling slightly, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and regret, but Maya didn't meet his gaze, her eyes fixed on the window, the darkness outside a canvas for her thoughts. She wasn't interested in belated guilt, in the hollow apologies of those who had watched her suffer in silence. She'd already carried the weight of being invisible until she couldn't be ignored, a weight that had shaped her, strengthened her, made her the woman she was now, a woman who refused to be diminished. The intercom clicked on, and James's voice returned, calm and steady, a quiet authority in his tone. a voice that seemed to anchor the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be pushing back shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and devices are in airplane mode. The plane began to move, the hum of the engines filling the cabin, a low rumble that seemed to echo the shift in the air, a shift that felt like justice, a justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. Evelyn checked on passengers, stopping at Maya's row, her movements deliberate, her voice soft, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. "I was briefed," she said gently, kneeling slightly, her eyes meeting Maya's with a quiet respect, a respect that felt genuine, not forced. "What happened should never have happened, and it won't be ignored." Maya nodded, her expression neutral but appreciative, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect she'd been denied earlier. Evelyn's respect was genuine, not pitying. That was all Maya had ever wanted, a simple recognition of her humanity, a recognition that felt like a victory she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. A young woman in the row behind leaned forward, her hands ringing nervously, her voice a whisper that trembled with guilt, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and regret. "I saw everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her breath shallow as she spoke. "I didn't know what to do." Maya turned slightly, her gaze steady, her voice soft but firm, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. "You didn't have to do anything, but now you've seen it. You'll notice it next time. That matters." The woman nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, a quiet promise to do better, to be better, a promise that Maya hoped she'd keep, a promise that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The plane taxied slowly, the runway lights glowing ahead as night fell, casting long shadows across the cabin, a darkness that seemed to mirror the shadows in Maya's thoughts. Maya looked out the window, her faint reflection staring back. Not a victim, but a woman who'd held her ground, a woman who'd refused to be diminished, a woman who'd changed everything with her silence. Lily, standing near the bulkhead, met Maya's eyes for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred, a recognition of the power of quiet strength, a power that had grounded a plane and shifted the world. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky, the ascent smooth but heavy with meaning, a meaning that seemed to hum beneath the surface. No one clapped, no one cheered, but everyone on that flight would remember. Nothing had exploded, no voices were raised, yet a single decision, Sylvia's refusal to help, had grounded a plane, removed a seasoned crew member, and changed the airline's tone for the night. A quiet revolution that had unfolded without a single shout, a revolution that felt like justice, a justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began to shift, reaching for tablets, adjusting pillows, trying to return to normalcy. But the atmosphere remained charged, the air thick with the memory of what had happened, a memory that seemed to linger like a shadow. Maya reclined her seat slightly, mindful of her back, the emotional weight of the day settling into her bones, a heavy burden that pressed against her chest, a burden that seemed to carry the echoes of every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd been made to feel less than. She wasn't tired, exactly, but there was an exhaustion that came from proving her existence, a weariness that seeped into her very being, a weariness that felt like a battle she'd been fighting her whole life. A new flight attendant, a man named Thomas with a kind face, approached her seat, his voice warm, genuine, not scripted, a warmth that felt like a balm against the wounds of the day. "We're serving refreshments. May I offer you anything?" His tone was a balm, a quiet kindness that Maya hadn't realized she needed, a kindness that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. "Sparkling water, if you have it," Maya said softly, her voice steady but laced with a quiet gratitude, a gratitude that felt like a lifeline in the storm of her thoughts. He smiled, pouring it into a glass, the bubbles fizzing softly against the sides, a sound that felt like a small, grounding comfort in the chaos of her thoughts. "I'll also bring a warmed blanket. If you need a stretch, let us know." We'll make this flight as comfortable as possible." Maya nodded, watching him walk away, his footsteps soft against the carpeted aisle, his presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. For the first time that day, she exhaled fully, not from triumph, but because the care being offered wasn't a favor, a care that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. It was how things should have been, a simple recognition of her humanity, a recognition that felt like a lifeline in the storm of her thoughts. An older woman in a tan blazer turned to her, her voice soft, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and respect, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "You handled that with grace. I just wanted to say that." Maya gave a polite nod, her expression neutral but appreciative, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect she'd been denied earlier. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, then added, her voice trembling slightly, "I've seen things like that before, but I've never seen anyone held accountable." Maya's response was measured, her voice steady, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. "That's why they keep doing it." In the cockpit, James spoke quietly with ground control through his headset, filing a Madeira report about the incident, his voice steady but laced with a quiet gravity. "Yes, I've confirmed she was escorted off before pushback," he said, his hand gripping the armrest of his seat, his knuckles white with the effort. "The passenger involved remains calm. No disturbance." He paused, listening, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed the instructions. "Understood. I'll notify her husband after landing. He'll be at the gate." The conversation was brief, but the weight of it lingered, a weight that seemed to echo the gravity of the situation, a gravity that James couldn't ignore. Maya rested her head against the window, the glass cool against her skin, a small comfort in the storm of her thoughts. Her mind replayed the day, the insult, the dismissal, the way no one had stood up at first, the moment the flight shifted without her raising her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her silence had spoken louder than words, a silence that had grounded a plane and shifted the world, a silence that felt like a victory she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. Sylvia, wherever she was likely grappling with how a small act of disrespect had unraveled her career in under an hour, a career that had been built on confidence, but shattered by a single moment of disdain. The baby kicked again, and Maya smiled faintly. Not from the incident, but in spite of it, a smile that felt like hope, a hope she hadn't dared to feel until now. Her child would grow up in a world where dignity sometimes had to be defended quietly, a world where strength didn't always come with raised voices, a world where change could come from the quietest of acts, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The cabin adjusted to a new rhythm, conversation softer, movement slower, a rhythm that seemed to echo the shift in the air, a shift that felt like justice, a justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. The clinking of glasses and cutlery was subdued, as if everyone was still processing what had happened, a memory that seemed to linger like a shadow. Maya's sparkling water sat half-finished, condensation dripping down the glass, a small puddle forming on the tray table, a quiet reminder of the time that had passed, a time that felt like a lifetime. Evelyn returned with a blanket, draping it over Maya's legs, her movements deliberate, her voice soft, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. "Let me know if you need anything," she said gently, her eyes meeting Maya's with a quiet respect, a respect that felt genuine, not forced. "We'll check on you every half hour." Maya nodded, the attentive care a stark contrast to the earlier dismissal, a care that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Across the aisle, a young man in his mid-20s shifted uncomfortably, his movements jerky, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and regret. He'd watched the incident from a distance, staying silent, his silence a heavier burden than any words could have been. Now, as Maya reached for the in-flight magazine, he leaned over, his voice quiet, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I saw it all," he said, his voice trembling slightly, his breath shallow as he spoke. "What she said, how she treated you. I should have said something." I froze. Maya looked at him, his sincerity clear in his fidgeting hands, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and regret. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice steady, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. He swallowed, his voice trembling slightly. "But I owe myself the truth. I stayed quiet because I thought someone else would step in." Maya nodded, her expression neutral but appreciative, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth he'd spoken, a truth that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Most people do. Behind them, an elderly couple whispered, their glances landing on Maya, their voices a low hum that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. The husband pulled out a notepad and wrote, passing it to Evelyn as she walked by. "She deserves a formal apology. We all saw what happened." The note was simple but weighty. Passenger statements carried power, a power that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope, a hope that Maya hadn't dared to feel until now. In the cockpit, James finished his report, documenting timestamps, names, and passenger accounts, a report that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. He'd never filed a live conduct report in the air before, but this flight was different, a difference that felt like justice, a justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. A call came through his headset, the voice on the other end clipped and authoritative, a voice that carried the weight of power. "We've coordinated with ground security," the voice said, its tone firm, a finality that hit James like a physical blow. "Her husband will be at the gate with an executive escort. The board requests a debrief." James replied, his voice steady. "I'll speak with him personally. My statement's submitted." The voice added, "We'll need a formal account from the remaining crew and the passenger herself." James nodded to himself, his jaw set, his voice calm but firm. "She's calm. She'll speak when she's ready." The conversation was brief, but the weight of it lingered, a weight that seemed to echo the gravity of the situation, a gravity that James couldn't ignore. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered its late evening phase, the soft amber glow casting long shadows across the cabin, a darkness that seemed to mirror the shadows in Maya's thoughts. Maya leaned her head back, pulling the blanket higher, her mind alert but her body at peace, a peace that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The attendants checked on her quietly, leaving her in a silence born of respect, not avoidance, a silence that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope, a hope that Maya hadn't dared to feel until now. She gazed out the window, the stars faint but steady, the moon casting a silver glow on the wings, a glow that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Her phone buzzed through the blanket, a message from gate operations. "Passenger escort and executive team will be waiting at door 2L upon arrival. Please remain seated." Maya's lips curved slightly, a quiet understanding settling in, an understanding that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. This was no longer about one flight. It was about what happens when someone endures public humiliation and responds with dignity, not rage. It was about an airline forced to choose between silence and standards. It was about a woman, tired, pregnant, polite, who refused to disappear when someone decided she didn't matter, a refusal that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The cabin lights remained dim, casting a soft amber glow as the flight entered its final stretch. The soft glow a stark contrast to the harshness of the day. Most passengers slept or scrolled through entertainment, but the memory of the earlier events lingered like ripples on water, a memory that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Maya stayed awake, her gaze shifting between the overhead light and the moonlit window, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions. Fear, hope, regret, a web that seemed to mirror the shadows in her thoughts. Her body was sore, her feet swollen, but she remained calm, her hand protective on her belly, a hand that seemed to carry the weight of the day, a weight that felt like a battle she'd been fighting her whole life. A row behind her, the man with the notepad tapped Evelyn during her routine check, his voice low, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "If there's a record of passenger statements, I'd like to add mine," he said firmly, his voice steady but laced with a quiet guilt, a guilt that seemed to press against his chest. It's not kindness, it's responsibility. We all watched it happen. Most of us said nothing. That doesn't sit right with me. Evelyn nodded, logging his seat number, her movements deliberate, her voice soft, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. I'll include your name and seat number in the internal report, she said, her voice steady. Her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. A woman stirred awake, whispering to her husband, her voice a low hum that seemed to blend with the plane's engines. That's the one the flight was grounded for, isn't it? He nodded, his voice steady, his words a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. She didn't do anything. That's the point, he replied, his voice steady, his words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better, a promise that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Evelyn logged the conversation in the internal report, which grew longer with each hour. Passenger feedback, crew statements, timelines, all documented with precision, a precision that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya adjusted in her seat, pulling the blanket higher, her thoughts drifting to Daniel, waiting on the ground. She pictured him standing calmly, not pacing, but prepared to speak with the clarity he always brought to moments like this, a clarity that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The intercom chimed, and James's voice returned, calm and focused, a voice of authority that seemed to anchor the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We'll land in approximately 25 minutes. The cabin stirred, passengers rousing from sleep, straightening seats, but the atmosphere remained altered. Everyone more aware, more conscious of those around them. A consciousness that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Evelyn checked on Maya one last time, her movements deliberate, her voice soft, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. Gate security has been informed. Your escort will meet you first. They've asked you to remain seated until they arrive. Maya nodded, her expression neutral but appreciative, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect she'd been denied earlier. I know, Evelyn hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. I've logged everything. Every crew member, every passenger who came forward. The company will see it. Maya studied her, her gaze steady, her voice soft but firm. And if no one had said anything? Evelyn looked down, her voice trembling slightly. Then the story would have ended differently. Maya leaned back, the baby kicking as if sensing they were close. A kick that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Passengers fumbled with bags, collected jackets, turned off screens, but their glances toward her now carried awareness, some even regret, a regret that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The hum of the aircraft deepened as it descended, the runway lights sparkling in the distance. A promise of closure, a promise that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The plane dipped lower, the landscape below becoming clearer. Clusters of lights tracing roads and neighborhoods beneath a velvet sky. A sky that seemed to hold the promise of a new beginning. A beginning that felt like a small victory. A victory that felt like hope. Inside, seat belts clicked, tray tables snapped shut. A gentle nervousness settling over the cabin. Not from turbulence, but from anticipation. An anticipation that felt like a small victory. A victory that felt like hope. They all knew something else was coming. A something that felt like justice. A justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. Maya stayed still, her blanket folded across her lap, her hands resting on her stomach, fingers loosely intertwined, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around her, a strength that had changed everything. Her phone remained untouched. She knew Daniel was already there, a knowledge that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, followed by a collective breath of silence, a silence that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. No one clapped. The mood subdued, a mood that seemed to echo the gravity of the situation, a gravity that felt like justice, a justice that Maya hadn't sought but couldn't deny. James's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The local time is 8:47 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off. On behalf of the flight crew, thank you for your patience." The cabin lights brightened as the plane taxied to the gate. The soft glow a stark contrast to the harshness of the day. Maya looked out the window, spotting a small group at the arrival gate. Daniel in a gray suit, his posture straight, flanked by 2 airline executives and a security officer. A sight that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. An announcement followed. "We kindly ask all passengers to remain seated. A company representative will board shortly to meet with a specific passenger." Murmurs spread, passengers exchanging nervous looks, but they all knew who it was for, a knowledge that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya kept her hand steady, her composure unshaken, a composure that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Evelyn approached, her movements deliberate, her voice soft, her presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's coldness. "They're ready. They'll come to you. Stay seated until they ask." Maya nodded once, her expression neutral but appreciative, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect she'd been denied earlier, a respect that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The door opened, and 2 figures stepped inside. Daniel and a senior security officer, their presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Daniel walked down the aisle, his eyes scanning until they found Maya, his gaze steady, his posture calm, a calm that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. He leaned in, his voice low. "You okay?" She nodded, her voice steady, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. "Yes." He turned to Evelyn, his voice steady. "Thank you for your handling of the second half of this flight. You'll be included in the report." Evelyn nodded, understanding the unspoken gratitude, a gratitude that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The second man, Director Charles Evans, stepped forward, his tone firm but tired, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and respect. "Ma'am, on behalf of the airline, I'd like to formally apologize for what happened. It's been escalated to the board. You're not required to give a statement tonight unless you wish to, but your experience is being taken seriously." Maya's voice was soft but unwavering, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. "Will anything change because of this?" Charles met her gaze, his voice steady. "Yes, it already has." Maya gathered her blanket and handbag, standing slowly on her own, her movements deliberate, her posture steady, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around her. The cabin fell silent, every eye on her as she walked past row after row, her steps measured, the officers and executives clearing the path. She wasn't rushed, wasn't escorted like someone in trouble. She was being acknowledged, a recognition that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. At the front, Lily gave her a respectful nod. Maya paused, nodded back, and stepped off the plane. The terminal air was cooler, cleaner, a stark contrast to the stale air of the plane. Maya walked beside Daniel, their hands not touching but in sync, a quiet partnership that spoke louder than words. Behind them, the airline officials followed, their faces serious, their steps measured. Ahead, reporters waited by the far windows. Word had leaked about the grounded flight over passenger mistreatment, though no names were released yet. Daniel guided her away from the noise, his hand gently on her lower back, a quiet gesture of support that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Inside the aircraft, passengers began gathering their bags, their movements slower, more thoughtful, a quiet reflection of the day's events. A woman near the front broke the silence, her voice soft, her words a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. She just sat there, and the whole airline moved. They weren't talking about a delay anymore. They were talking about what it meant to be seen, a truth that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya and Daniel walked down a private terminal corridor, her heels echoing softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the strength she'd shown. They didn't speak, their silence said enough. The executives kept their distance, knowing this was her moment, not theirs. Conclusion. They reached a secure door at the corridor's end, where a staff member held it open, leading to a quiet lounge. Maya entered first, easing into a leather chair, the weight finally lifting from her back, a quiet relief that felt like a deep breath after a long storm. Daniel stayed by the door, speaking softly with one of the directors, his voice steady, his posture calm, a calm that spoke of a partnership forged in trust. Moments later, the director of ethics and conduct, Richard Hayes, entered, his expression firm but respectful, his badge clipped to a charcoal suit, a symbol of the authority he carried. "Mrs. Carter," he began formally, "you're under no pressure to speak tonight. We've received crew statements, the pilot's log, passenger notes, and a galley recording. But if you wish to share your thoughts, just for the record, what mattered most to you?" Maya leaned back, her hand on her belly, her voice steady, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. "I wasn't shocked. It's not the first time someone's made me feel like I don't belong. It's not even the worst, but it's the first time they got caught in front of people who couldn't look away." Richard listened, letting her continue, his silence a quiet respect that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. "She didn't just refuse to help. She decided who I was, what I was worth. Assumed I was exaggerating, needy, asking for too much because I asked for something small." She paused, her gaze distant, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions. Fear, hope, regret, a web that seemed to mirror the shadows in her thoughts. "The plane didn't stop because she shouted at me. It stopped because no one else stepped in. That silence, that's what made this different. It wasn't just her mistake. It was everyone's permission." Richard nodded, absorbing her words, his expression thoughtful, his silence a quiet respect that spoke louder than words. "I'll be honest," Maya continued, her voice steady, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. "I didn't want her fired. I didn't need an apology. I needed someone to finally see what people like me deal with every day and not brush it off as a misunderstanding." Richard shifted, his voice steady. "We're revising protocols, bias training, crew accountability, escalation processes. This won't just be paperwork. It'll be policy with enforcement." Maya met his eyes, her gaze steady, her voice soft but firm, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. "Make sure it's real." He nodded, his voice steady. "It will be." Richard left, and Daniel sat beside her, taking her hand, his touch a quiet comfort that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. "You okay?" he asked gently, his voice steady, his eyes wide with a mix of pride and concern. Maya looked at him, a faint smile on her lips, a smile that felt like hope, a hope she hadn't dared to feel until now. "I think I will be." They sat in silence, the faint clatter of passengers deboarding echoing in the distance, a distant reminder of the world outside, a world that seemed to move on while they sat in this quiet moment. Some would rush to connections, others would forget this night. But for a few, something had shifted, changing how they'd see others on future flights, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya looked out the window, watching the crew file past toward the shuttle, their footsteps a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the strength she'd shown. Lily glanced through the glass, giving a small wave, not for attention, but acknowledgement, a quiet gesture that spoke louder than words. Maya lifted her fingers in return, a quiet gesture that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Her baby kicked, and she whispered, "You're already watching the world change. Let's make sure it keeps going." Daniel's eyes shone with pride, a quiet admiration for the strength she'd shown, a strength that had changed everything. Outside, the airport hummed, baggage carts rumbling, PA systems calling flights, employees moving briskly, a world that seemed to move on while they sat in this quiet moment. But inside the lounge, time felt still, as if something profound had just happened, and the world hadn't caught up, a stillness that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya's body was exhausted, but her mind was sharp, a calm settling over her, not from rest, but from surviving a storm unbroken, a calm that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Daniel spoke softly on the phone with the airline's board secretary, his tone firm, a quiet strength that seemed to echo Maya's own. "We're not looking for headlines. We're looking for change, public, clear, lasting. You have our cooperation, but if this is delayed into months of review, you'll lose more than one passenger's trust." He ended the call and turned to Maya, his voice steady. "They're drafting a board-signed apology letter out within 48 hours. They also want to name you in their new bias response training initiative. You be the reason it exists." Maya's gaze drifted to the window, her voice soft but firm. "Let them name the change, not me. I wasn't the first. I'm just the one they couldn't ignore." Her words hung heavy, a quiet truth that seemed to fill the room, a truth that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. There had been others. Women dismissed, elderly passengers ignored, people judged for their appearance. A world that had forgotten them the moment they stepped off the plane. Maya hadn't been ignored because she refused to vanish. A refusal that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. A staff member entered with a folder, her voice soft. These were left by the director of ethics. Inside was a statement. Effective immediately, crew member Sylvia Monroe is on unpaid leave pending termination review. A mandatory bystander intervention training, the Carter Protocol, will be implemented for all flight staff. Maya handed it to Daniel, her voice steady. They gave it a name so they'll remember what happens when they pretend not to see. She rose slowly, stretching the tightness from her legs, and walked to the window, her movements deliberate, her posture steady, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. Another plane took off, another crew boarded, a world that seemed to move on while they stood in this quiet moment. Somewhere on that plane, someone would need kindness, would need to be seen, a need that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maybe now, the crew would think twice, not because of a lawsuit, but because of what they'd seen when no one yelled, and everything still changed, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Daniel stood beside her, his admiration clear, a quiet pride that seemed to fill the room. "Ready to go?" She nodded, her voice steady. "Yeah, I've got everything I need." They stepped toward the lounge exit, the hallway now empty. The commotion faded, a quiet that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya's footsteps were slow but steady, her shadow long and unshaken, a shadow that seemed to carry the weight of the day, a weight that felt like a battle she'd been fighting her whole life. She didn't look back. Everything behind her had already changed, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The terminal was quieter now, mostly airport staff and late arrivals, a world that seemed to move on while they walked in this quiet moment. The world outside buzzed. Check-in counters busy, departure screens blinking, conversations unhurried, a world that seemed to move on while they stood in this quiet moment. But for Maya, each step felt grounded in truth, a permanence born not of pain or victory, but of dignity, a dignity that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. They walked toward a private elevator to a lower level where a company car waited, a discreet exit for someone whose presence had made the powerful uncomfortable, an exit that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The hallway lights flickered, then stabilized, the air cool and still, a quiet that seemed to echo the strength she'd shown. Another plane lifted into the night, a reminder of the world outside, a world that seemed to move on while they stood in this quiet moment. A lone security officer stood at the elevator, nodding politely as he opened the doors, a quiet gesture that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Maya leaned against the wall inside, her hand on her belly, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around her. Daniel stood beside her, watching the floor numbers light up, a quiet partnership that spoke louder than words. He didn't ask how she felt. He knew this moment couldn't be summed up in a word, a knowledge that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The elevator opened to an underground arrival bay, a black SUV waiting with its headlights on, a quiet exit that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The driver held the door open, his movements deliberate, his presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Before stepping in, Maya looked up at the plain, concrete ceiling, a space people pass through without noticing. Just like this experience was meant to be, a space that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. But it hadn't stayed unnoticed, a truth that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. She turned to Daniel, her voice soft but firm. "Do you think she'll ever realize what she did?" He thought for a moment, his voice steady. "Maybe, but this wasn't just about her." Maya nodded, her gaze drifting past the car to the runway. A quiet reflection that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. What scared me most wasn't her rudeness or her refusal to help. It was how normal it felt, how easy it was for her to assume I didn't deserve more than dismissal. Daniel listened, his silence a steady support, a quiet strength that seemed to echo Maya's own. "That's what people don't understand," Maya continued, her voice steady, her words a quiet promise, a promise to do better, to be better. Disrespect doesn't always come with raised voices. Sometimes it's in a turn back, a shrug, the way someone speaks to you like you're a burden before you even open your mouth. And when no one stands up, when everyone pretends not to see, it becomes normal. Daniel placed his hand on her back, his voice steady. "Not tonight. Not anymore." Maya exhaled, stepping into the car, Daniel following, a quiet partnership that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. As the vehicle pulled away, the airport lights stretched behind them, rows of white and yellow glowing in the night, a world that seemed to move on while they stood in this quiet moment. People would board flights tonight, tomorrow, next week, hoping for peace, respect, a quiet journey, a hope that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Some would ask for help, a need that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. And thanks to one grounded plane, one steady voice, one woman's refusal to be overlooked, someone in a uniform might pause, might think twice, not because of media, but because of what they saw when nothing was on fire and everything still changed, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. The car's hum was soft, steady, a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the strength she'd shown. Daniel took her hand, his touch a quiet comfort that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Outside, the night sky stretched wide above them, a canvas of stars that seemed to hold the promise of a new beginning, a beginning that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Inside, Maya was writing a new beginning, a beginning that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. And for the first time in a long time, the world was learning to listen, a lesson that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. This story of Maya Carter, a pregnant woman mistreated on a flight, holds profound lessons in dignity, accountability, and the power of quiet courage. It teaches that respect is non-negotiable, no matter how someone looks or what they ask for. Maya's steadfast dignity forced an airline to face its failures, showing that standing firm without rage can spark real change, a change that felt like a small victory, a victory that felt like hope. Reflect on a time you've witnessed or experienced subtle disrespect. How did you respond? Share your story in the comments below, or use hashtag Carter Protocol on social media to join the conversation about standing up for dignity. Your voice matters, and we'd love